Hello, everyone. My name is Russ White, and I'll be presenting today on stylized terrain shading through layer blending, or how to draw maps with GIS. A little bit about me. I work at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo. I use he, him, his pronouns. And in my role, I work at Kennedy Library, where I work across different disciplines with students, staff, and faculty to apply GIS data, visualization, and other technical tools in all sorts of scholarly and creative works. And in our role in the library, we advocate for data literacy, spatial literacy, and then applying a careful critique of how data is used in our decision making across all these different domains that we find where we're working with data. I've been a Cal Poly alum as a student, also an instructor, a researcher, and collaborator, and I'm excited to present and meet with this group for the first time. We have a land acknowledgement here at Cal Poly, recognizing that the land on which Cal Poly sits carries the heritage and culture of the indigenous people of San Luis Obispo County, the Yaqui Tutu Yaktalini, the Northern Chumash tribe. So we seek to honor the indigenous people's connection to these territories and respect the land on which we gather. And there's a responsibility here to think of this as an acknowledgement, but also in action and in our consideration as we go about the type of work that we do, particularly in mapping. And I think that'll be a growing theme, noting the keynote and other presentations here at this conference. I'm excited to incorporate those into some of the discussions that we'll have and how we design maps, what they mean, what those aesthetic choices might impart, and how do we evaluate all those. Today's talk draws from a number of different inspirations, and you could see maybe a few that are familiar. So in one case, the hand-drawn hillshade tutorial by Sarah Bell, previous NACIS presentation. Of course, the how-to blogs on the ArcGIS blog from John Nelson and others. There's a lot of inspiration there that I've been able to draw on. The Stamen watercolor base map, which is a great illustration of how different media can be applied through digital mapping. And I thought, well, is there a way to do this with terrain or other kinds of base maps just to be able to mix up the styles? And lastly, I'd seen this figure from a paper on how to create a hatching effect. And this image kind of stuck in my mind for a later application. So just a preview of some of these elements that are drawn together. And what I was hoping to do is create some kind of variations of styles on terrain using GIS tools. So working through that hand-drawn hillshade tutorial from Sarah Bell, I used an area of terrain near San Luis Obispo. Here's a hike I had recently done in Montana de Oro. Okay, I put the terrain as a hillshade in a perspective view, and then practiced the art of hill shading by hand, and which is really sketching areas of shade and light through successive layers of graphite. And it's a very meditative process. And as I was going through that process of layering graphite and then blending to soften the edges and then layering and blending, your mind starts to drift. And ArcGIS Pro 2.7 had just come out, and one of the main features was layer blending. And so a thought occurred, can you create a layer so that areas of shadow would be represented by a greater number of overlapping polygons? And there was this thought that maybe you could blend layers through stacking and utilize some of that texture that you could get from a hand-drawn texture or other kinds of textures in those polygons. So with that question in mind, I think the answer was yes. And it turns out that there's a tool that does just exactly that. Inexplicably, the contour tool, with its variations, specifically the contour shell, when applied to the hillshade, will make just this overlapping polygons where the areas of deepest shadow end up receiving the most overlap. So here's the deepest shadow, and it's got a small island. And then the midtones receive these larger overlapping polygons, and the highlights would be a solid fill. It's counterintuitive, but once you get it set up, you just kind of go with it. And so we'll look at how this kind of process can be put into place in the next couple of steps. So to start with our shading, we'll use a shaded relief. And I went ahead and used the sky model, which is a part of the terrain tools within the ArcGIS terrain tools toolbox, which you can download online. The benefit of the sky model, even though it takes a little longer, is that you can create some soft shadows. And that's kind of the key to making things look with a different aesthetic than the hard or kind of abrupt shadows of typical hillshade. So with that shaded relief, we applied the contour shell tool, and it's just a bunch of polygons, but they are overlapping. And imagine these vertically, like in that illustration before, stacking up. Right now, there's just a solid gray, but to start utilizing the layer blending, you can set the feature blend mode to multiply or linear burn. And that way, those overlaps start to turn into shading in those areas of deepest shadow to the areas of highlight. So more overlap, less overlap. All right, well, that's just about where we started. It's a polygon version of a hillshade. So where do we go from here? Well, instead of a solid gray fill, we can get a pencil sketch texture and apply it as a picture fill. And it's starting to look like something. We have a little bit of a scribble effect going across, but it's not super clear. And so there's a few additional components that we can adjust to start developing our image. Right now, all these polygons are stacked exactly on top of each other. So to get some cross-hatching, we need to rotate those polygons so that they start having different areas of overlap. So with our attributes in ArcGIS, we can set a rotation, and I'm just using the contour field, which is, indicating these different angles that we can just range from 0 to 360 perhaps. And so just by effect, we now went from a very rigid set of sketches to a softer set of overlaps. So all of a sudden we have a very reasonably looking sketch with just a polygon version of our hillshade. It turns out that this is pretty flexible for being able to adjust and stylize. So we don't have a lot of definition. Often in the case of this process, the answer was just more blending. So to add a little bit of contrast, we could put the original hillshade back on and set it to overlay or soft light or hard light. And that would give it a little bit more definition to those shadow areas. With one image texture, we can kind of adjust the size, the scale, or the rotation of those strokes. But what else can we do with the same idea? So here's a pen set of strokes, parallel lines. And when you put those in with rotation, all of a sudden you get kind of a different effect of a pen or a ballpoint crosshatch, a loose crosshatch for this area. And all of a sudden, this takes on a whole different character just with a different style. Same layer, same blending setup, just a new image texture. Here's a little stipple effect. And what's really, I think, nice about this is you can adjust the scale of that by just adjusting the size of the fill. And we'll look at this in ArcGIS Pro shortly. How do you kind of adjust for a different look, even within the same layer? So here's a little detail view. Zooming in, you get actually a nice dynamic effect where the stipple will redraw itself at different zoom levels. And so here's a little bit more contrast. In order to keep some edges, I used an edge enhancing technique called difference of Gaussian. And I use the white box tools, if that's familiar with folks. Great set of tools for image processing within ArcGIS. And there's a little bit more definition on those edges in addition to our stipple. Of course, we could do things like a hypsometric tint with the DEM. Here's one more example using the watercolor style from John Nelson on the Esri styles. And this is a nice overlay. And it's, again, blending through 9 or 10 different layers of hillshade polygons in addition to the hillshade itself for a nice modeled watercolor effect. So as you can see, lots of different ways of combining maybe the elevation layer, multiple versions of the hillshade, and these different sketch textures just to create different effects that might impart a different stylized effect for different purposes. I'll switch gears and look in ArcGIS Pro just to show some of the dynamic quality of these visuals. All right, so here we are in ArcGIS Pro. I've got some sample terrain here near Kings Canyon National Park in California. And I have my pencil sketch as my current layer. And just to show some of the nice effects that happen just by zooming in and out, those polygons change size and the picture fill changes along with those. So you get kind of for free this nice dynamic effect. Um, and it does kind of cache a little bit as you work on your browser or work on ArcGIS Pro. So that was a fun discovery. That was a little bit unexpected. So one other unexpected find was that if these can be dynamic, they can be animated. And so here's a little looping GIF exported directly from ArcGIS Pro. I just gave this layer the attribute of time, gave it 4 camera keyframes, and then advanced that time to go through. So as each frame drew, it would redraw the polygons in a new configuration to give it a little sketch effect in addition to animating the camera motion. So that was a maybe inspired somewhat by a 1980s music video. I might have some more work to do to really live up to that effect, but it was a fun challenge to try animating a little bit of this style using just ArcGIS Pro. Few other parting shots. It is possible to do fairly large areas, and then this can also be tiled into image tiles. They could be put on ArcGIS Online or other web browsers, or put into very large layouts for export. And so here's just a little detail of a high resolution export with an oblique view from ArcScene or ArcGIS Pro, using those textures in a little bit of a 3D mode, again, over Kings Canyon. So those were just some explorations. One of the shortcomings is that you can't draw directly down the slope. No matter how you try to arrange those, it's really hard to control where those strokes get placed in terms of the orientation of the slope. And so one future area is, there are ways of drawing streamlines along the terrain slope, and there's a way to accomplish this in a tool called ParaView. So just a little tip on ways of drawing those kind of Hosher-like flow lines. And there's a great article that describes this, but implementing that is a challenge, and there's a tool called ParaView to do something like that. So overall, the tools that we use shape the decisions that we make when we're designing maps. As we explore different methods, we kind of get new ideas and recombine them in some unexpected ways. I think there's lots of room to bring in more types of design processes into map making. And when we do that, we just have to be thinking about what does this look like, how does it read, and when to apply those different stylized choices in different settings and different circumstances. Hope that had some ideas for folks, and look forward to the rest of the conference. Thanks.